Hello and welcome back to the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. In this episode, the first of 2022, we look back at a speech that was written and delivered 60 years ago this year. It was a speech that horrified Roy Jenkins but rather pleased Tony Benn. It was a speech that would be used against the Labour Party by its opponents in decades to come, but not because they thought the speech was bad, but because they thought it was good. It is a speech that was delivered by one of Labour's almost forgotten leaders. I am, of course, talking about Hugh Gaitskell's 1962 Labour Party conference speech, the 1,000 Years of History speech.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that. Outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
Hugh Gaitskell was, in many ways, an unlikely leader of the Labour Party. This was not due to him being an inept or useless politician, but rather more due to his background. Labour is often associated with people from working class backgrounds, and for good reason, because it is a party that was set up to represent the interests of working people, working class people. But it's also a party that has attracted over its long history as many middle class people as working class people. Hugh Todd Naylor Gaitskell, and yes, that was his name, was born in 1906 in Kensington, the son of Arthur Gaitskell of the Indian Civil Service and Adelaide Mary Jameson. It's worth looking at Gaitskell's background in order to understand not only his personal circumstances, but the perspective with which he viewed political life, because it helped inform his actions as a politician and as a speechmaker. Gaitskell was born in the year of the Liberal landslide of 1906, a time in which politics was rapidly changing. The party that he would one day lead, the newly formed Labour Party, was slowly gaining momentum thanks to a backroom deal between Ramsay MacDonald and then Liberal Chief Whip Herbert Gladstone, which allowed Labour to pick up 27 new seats, ensuring that Labour now had 30 seats in total. Gaitskell's upbringing was very different from that of many of the newly elected Labour MPs. Whilst many members of Labour in 1906 wished to see a firm end to the empire as quickly as possible, Gaitskell's entire family were entrenched in it. His father, Arthur, was the son of a lieutenant colonel in the Indian Army, James Gandy Gaitskell, who, despite spending most of his life in India, died in Cheltenham. Arthur followed his father into service in India, but unlike his elder brother, who also went into the Indian Army, Arthur served in the Indian Civil Service, eventually rising to become an assistant commissioner in Burma, in what of course is now Myanmar. Hugh's mother came from a similar family. Her father, George Jameson, was a judge on the British Supreme Court in China before becoming the British Consul General in Shanghai. What is important to stress is that Gaitskell's family saw empire in a way that was almost exactly opposite to the Labour MPs of 1906. Whereas the Labour MPs saw it as in many ways, often overblown and decrepit institution which didn't help anyone and which subjugated ordinary people, though it is also worth making clear that there were Labour MPs and Labour members in 1906 who saw the empire as not a bad thing. In contrast, Gaitskell's family saw it as an institution that provided opportunity. Hugh's maternal grandfather, Alexander Jameson, was a farmer, and yet his son ended up Consul General in one of the most important parts of the British Empire. Similarly, his grandfather, James Gandy Gaitskell's father, Henry, that's Hugh's great-grandfather, had been a London wine merchant. Not a bad position, but nowhere near as lucrative as the professions of his descendants. So it clearly makes abundantly apparent that the situation that Hugh Gaitskell found himself in was one born into a family of comfortable means and means that were built on the administration of the British Empire. Gaitskell's background was essentially immersed in empire, and that greatly influenced his speech-making and also his political positions, as we will see later on. Turning from his ancestry to his early life, Gaitskell was shaken at a young age by the death of his father, Arthur, in 1915. However, he would soon find himself with a stepfather, who happened to be a cousin of P.G. Wodehouse, and a new sense of responsibility. Gaitskell's educational career progressed through the bastions of the establishment, Dragon School in Oxford, followed by Winchester, and eventually New College, Oxford, institutions that are associated with Britain's elites and of the governing class of Britain. It was whilst at Oxford that Gaitskell would gain his socialist values. He studied PPE under GDR Cole, who was a Fabian writer and passionate about social reform. In fact, he was one of the great social writers of the mid-1910s and going into the 1920s. Cole's Fabianism obviously put him in a position that we would now consider perhaps more on the right of the Labour Party, which is of course similar to Gaitskell's eventual positioning in the Labour Party's internal ideological gambit, its ideological timeline. Gaitskell, like many young socialists, was engaged by the 1926 general strike, and from then on he decided that his path would not only be different in terms of geography, but also in terms of politics from that of his ancestors. He was determined to represent Labour and its interests in one manner or another. It's important to note that Gaitskell did not cut his imperial roots entirely, and of course this would affect him during his time as leader as well. During the 1930s, he made appearances at dinners given by the China Association, an imperial association if there ever was one, and his attitude towards the rest of the world, though changed by his time on the left, would still be influenced by his background. And again, we will see that throughout this podcast, that Gaitskell's imperial background greatly influenced the way that he approached politics, particularly foreign affairs. Gaining a first-class honours degree in PPE in 1927, Gaitskell went out into the bright and wide world to get into politics, active politics. He spent time during a brief stint in the Workers' Educational Association in Nottinghamshire, helping teaching miners and helping promote education amongst miners. However, this wasn't really to his tastes. Instead, Gaitskell, like many young men of his generation, moved in 1928 to University College London, the University of London, to become a lecturer in economics. During the 1930s, Gaitskell would focus on making a name in writing and promoting himself as a public intellectual concerned with the economy. His main focus was economics. The PPE degree that he had undertaken obviously influenced him in terms of economics rather than necessarily philosophy or directly politics, at least initially. His focus would be on being an economist and making his name as an economist, which of course would in some ways hamstring him later on. He didn't really develop in the same way that other Labour leaders before and after him would, as great a grasp of foreign policy when it wasn't directly related to economics. During this period, he contributed, alongside John Maynard Keynes, to the 1933 book What Everyone Wants to Know About Money, edited by his former Oxford mentor, Cole. Gaitskell's chapter dealt with the economists C.H. Douglas, Frederick Soddy, Silvio Gesell, and Robert Eisler. Gaitskell referred to them as the four heretics due to their collective attitude towards monetarism. He referred to Douglas's theories on social credit as incomprehensible and argued that nobody truly knew what Douglas was getting at. Indeed, Of all the four writers, Gaitskell wrote that he believed that he found the task of criticising them tedious and difficult, and found that it would be impossible to truly criticise any of them definitively because of the levels of incomprehensibility of their work. Gaitskell was essentially arguing that their economic theories were so overblown and so overcomplicated that he couldn't even really address them properly because they were just so overly filled with economic theory that they weren't applicable in the same ways that other economic theories would be. And it's interesting that he particularly attacked Douglas because the idea of social credit, which was one which Douglas had pioneered and come up with, was quite in vogue in certain circles in the 1930s. So Gaitskell's position is very much an interesting one. Even though he was obviously originally influenced by one of the great early thinkers of the Fabian Society, which again, some people would interpret as putting him on the right of the Labour Party, this stance against social credit certainly does make it clear that he was not one of the ardent left-wingers of the Labour Party. What's interesting is that Gaitskell, during this period, was in many ways forming himself, not just as an economist, but as a politician. He was forming the particular wing of the Labour Party that he would stand on, even though at other times his stance in particular issues would be perhaps somewhat muddy, and his exact ideological position, although generally on the right, was not always consistently on the right, as would be the case later on. So throughout the 1930s, it's clear that Gaitskell was beginning to build himself a reputation as a public intellectual by contributing to different discussions, different lectures, and publishing books, and even appearing on radio programmes, such as in 1932 when he hosted The Problems of Currency. In 1932, the same year, he managed to successfully gain the Labour nomination for the seat of Chatham. Chatham had twice been held by Labour, once in 1906 and again once in 1929. The seat had last been held by Labour under Frank Markham, who had defected with Ramsay MacDonald to the National Labour group the previous year. MacDonald, of course, had wanted to go into an arrangement with the Conservatives because the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party in the early 1930s didn't agree with MacDonald's belief that there needed to be further cuts in order for Britain to make its way out of the 1929 worldwide depression, which of course had been caused by the stock market crash. MacDonald's position was very much in direct opposite to that of FDR, who of course, the New Deal in the United States very much focused more on investment in people rather than austerity and cuts. So MacDonald was very much not on the same page as both FDR and many people in his party. Frank Markham had decided to stand in the 1931 election in Nottingham South, and he would eventually become the Conservative MP for Buckingham in 1951. He'd retire in 1964, just before his seat of Buckingham was taken in that year's general election by a young Labour candidate named Robert Maxwell. Now, Markham's defection to Nottingham left the seat wide open, and in 1931 it was gained by the Conservative candidate Sir Park Gough, a baronet and former barrister. Now, when it came to the 1935 election, the election that was coming up when Gaitskell gained the nomination, Gaitskell had youth on his side. Gough had been first elected as an MP back in 1918, and by 1935 he would be 64. By the same time, Gaitskell would be only 29, so clearly he would be seen as the more energetic candidate. However, when it actually came to the 1935 election, it didn't actually work, and Gaitskell failed to charm the Kent voters to win Chatham from Gough, and it would remain a Conservative seat for a number of years. He then returned to his work at UCL as a lecturer. He was becoming a senior lecturer in economics by this period, more than ever determined to get a Labour seat. And fortunately for him, a Labour seat was coming up for grabs. That would be the seat of Leeds South, which was currently represented by Henry Charlton. And Charlton was going to stand down at what was to be expected to be the 1940 or perhaps 1939, depending on when the general election was called, but certainly in the next few years, the coming general election. However, of course, Gaitskell, as everybody at that time wasn't aware, the 1940 general election would not occur. By 1938, Gaitskell was touring the seat of Leeds South regularly, attempting to drum up as much support as possible and to show that he was someone who would represent the interests of his constituents as well as possible. And indeed, in 1938, he gave an economic lecture on the Labour Party's relationship with the banking sector, arguing that Labour didn't need to nationalise bank shares because it could trust the banks to cooperate with a left-wing government. In fact, he went even further, going on to argue that finance was often seen as the Achilles heel of social democracy, because he felt that Labour wasn't readily enough trusted by the public on the economy. This, of course, could be seen as in the wake of Labour's catastrophic defeat in 1931, which had in part been played on the economy and in part Labour's opposition to Ramsay MacDonald's fiscal policy and the policy that Ramsay MacDonald and the Conservatives would pursue in the 1930s. So clearly, as is often the case, unfortunately, with the Labour Party at different points in its history, the economy and economic trust with Labour was something that was very much on Gaitskell's mind. And the lecture got him a round of applause. And clearly, there was a great deal of prospective constituents who were interested and enthusiastic in Gaitskell as their next MP. However, Gaitskell would have to wait until 1945 to enter Parliament due to the approaching storm clouds that hovered over Europe. The previous year, Gaitskell had got married to Anna Dora Frost, who was a recently divorced former medical student born in Latvia, whose father had been a Hebrew scholar. Gaitskell had first met Dora when she was still married to her husband, Isaac Frost, a lecturer in physiology. Gaitskell's romantic life was certainly complicated, and his sexuality, both then and now, has been open to a certain amount of debate. Gaitskell and Frost's marriage came at the perfect time for him, as it seemed like everything in his future was going smoothly. Gaitskell had risen to be the head of the economics department at University College, he was married, and he had a fairly safe Labour seat that was ready for him to occupy once the 1940 election came. So everything at the end of the 1930s seemed to be going Gaitskell's way. However, by 1939, it was clear that Britain would be engaged in a war that would consume the whole world, and one that would ultimately put Gaitskell's political ambitions on the back burner. During the Second World War, Gaitskell was not drafted into the army, but rather into the civil service. As the private secretary and effective aide-de-camp to Hugh Dalton, Minister of Economic Warfare in the wartime coalition government of Winston Churchill, Gaitskell was able to be in the very thick of what was happening with the coalition government. He would eventually move alongside Hugh Dalton to the Board of Trade in 1942. And Gaitskell and Dalton got on to a fairly good degree. Indeed, Roy Jenkins would later remark that for Gaitskell in politics, friendships and being able to have a good relationship with people were very much key to being on the right side of Gaitskell. If you weren't a friend of Gaitskell, then you wouldn't get any influence or any time of day with him. But if you were a friend of Gaitskell, if you were an admirer of him, then you could do no wrong. And as Jenkins said at the time, he believed that was perhaps also a flaw of Gaitskell's, that he, rather than having an entirely objective and critical view of the way people acted and their performance in relation to him and whether they were serving under him or working alongside him, that meant that he was in some ways weaker because his objectivity was blurred by the friendships that he had. Gaitskell's time in the wartime coalition would help sharpen not just his ambition, but also his ability to interact with other ministers and officials. And it's interesting to note the distinction between those who served during the Second World War in active service and went on to be Labour politicians like Denis Healey and Tony Benn, and those who didn't actively serve on the front lines, such as Gaitskell and Harold Wilson. The sight of bloodshed at first hand certainly had profound effects on both Benn and Healey, though in quite different ways, and it would colour their political careers and their attitudes to war. Gaitskell and Wilson's wartime work was marked less by the horrors of war and more by the studious analysis of figures, which would eventually help shape their political characters. In some ways, both Gaitskell and Wilson were perhaps less emotive figures than either Benn or Healey, and certainly part of that must have been due to the fact that rather than facing the horrors of war, as both Benn and Healey did, Gaitskell and Wilson were in some ways almost rather inoculated from the direct horrors of war and spent more time going over figures and working almost like a civil servant rather than as a soldier. So it certainly influenced the way that Gaitskell approached politics. He attempted to approach it in a much more studious way, though ironically his emotions would often get the better of him, and often his emotions would mark his political career in one way or the other. Gaitskell finally got his chance to enter Parliament in 1945 when he was elected alongside hundreds of other first-time Labour MPs in the party's first landslide victory. His closeness to Hugh Dalton prompted rumours that he would get a junior minister's position almost straight out of the way, but it would not be so easy, and certainly it would have been rather ill-opportune if Gaitskell had been given a ministerial post, even a junior ministerial post, so early on, because it would have seen to be pure and simple nepotism, which it probably would have been. Gaitskell's early career in Parliament was marked by his focus on the economy. Gaitskell spoke in favour of Hugh Dalton's bill to nationalise the Bank of England, certainly a change of opinion from Gaitskell of the 1930s, who had been quite vociferous in his remarks that Labour didn't need to nationalise bank shares. He similarly defended the Bretton Woods loan, an agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom that came out of the Bretton Woods monetary system. Whilst many members of the left of the Labour Party, including a young Michael Foot, signed a petition to force the government to turn down the loan, Gaitskell vigorously defended it, both to the PLP and in print. I'm now going to read an extract from the Daily Herald, in which Gaitskell argued, "We are not borrowing the money to pay for a honeymoon, but to get ourselves going again in business. Our aim must be to conduct that which the proceeds of the loan have all been spent. We shall be able to pay our way without any more on the tick." He then went to go on, in concluding his article for the Daily Herald, "Thus, Labour's first 5-year plan must be a building and creative plan rather than a consumption plan. If we stick to this, we need not fear that prosperity will complain to the burden of this loan. For we shall have used it as a bodybuilding tonic and not a soul-destroying drug." Gaitskell's ardent defence of the plan earned him plaudits, and it would not be long before he eventually got his rumoured junior ministership. In May 1946, Gaitskell became Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Fuel and Power, a role that Harold Wilson and many others had also believed that Harold Wilson would get. This, of course, is perhaps something of a sore point between Gaitskell and Wilson, and perhaps was the beginning of a bit of a rivalry between them that would certainly dominate their relationship over the coming decades. The reason for this was that the Minister for Fuel and Power, Manny Shinwell, one of Labour's most impressive MPs, great-uncle of Luciana Berger, and a man who had served under Ramsay MacDonald before beating MacDonald in the 1935 general election and taking MacDonald's seat. Manny Shinwell didn't like Harold Wilson. He thought that he was in some ways perhaps a bit shifty and not quite as much of a hard worker as Gaitskell. He thought he wouldn't get on quite as well with him as he would Gaitskell, so Gaitskell was chosen. And Gaitskell's first big task would be to get the Coal Nationalisation Bill of 1946 through the House of Commons or through the House of Lords into law. It would be a major responsibility, given the size of the coal industry in 1946 and the clear need for Labour to nationalise it in order to prove that it could continue their mission to nationalise major industries, despite protests from both the Conservatives and from the business sector. Gaitskell worked hard in steering the bill through the committee stages, and during the winding up debate at its second reading before the House, he gave the final speech winding up the debate. The bill focused on ensuring that nationalisation could go smoothly and quickly, and it's to Gaitskell's credit that he ensured that such crucial legislation was passed through the House of Commons. And it's interesting that Gaitskell was able to do this at a relatively early age, and also a relatively early point in his parliamentary career. He was barely in his 40s when the bill was passed, an age when many MPs are only starting out, both then and in many cases today as well. Whilst Gaitskell could take pride in his work on ensuring that the coal industry had become nationalised, it would be in peril. The winter of 1946 was not a happy one. So brutal was that winter that it would end up claiming the life of one of Labour's most senior ministers, the Education Secretary, Ellen Wilkinson. In fact, overall, Attlee's cabinet, looking back, were not a particularly healthy bunch. In particular, Stafford Cripps and Ernie Bevan both succumbed to ill health during the course of Attlee's 6 years in power. Now, the winter of 46 was not only disastrous for Labour because of the relatively early death of the brilliant minister, Ellen Wilkinson, but also because of how the public reacted to it, particularly in February 1947 when there was a fuel crisis. Now, Gaitskell can at least come out of this slightly better than his boss, because Gaitskell had warned Manny Shinwell that there was going to be a fuel crisis if something wasn't done, and Shinwell had simply ignored him, which of course led to a great deal of anger both at the Labour government and Shinwell. The fuel crisis would result in a breakdown across the country. Millions of homes were unable to heat themselves. There was no heating whatsoever in many of the homes. And of course, it's important to remember at the time that there were also many homes that were practically not really in existence. There was still a great deal of the country that had been affected by the Blitz, and there was a great deal of rubble in areas which had been previously entirely residential areas. There was still quite a lot that was left over from the Blitz. The fuel crisis also saw the BBC unable to broadcast, and it essentially meant that the country was at a standstill during the winter. Shinwell was forced to ask the cabinet to approve closing down of power stations, and because of this there were sporadic blackouts throughout February and into March, and staff in the House of Commons and in Buckingham Palace had to work by candlelight because there simply wasn't any power. Now, of course, this made Shinwell incredibly unpopular because he was seen as the one to blame for it. He received bomb threats and had to have armed police officers guard him. His failure to listen to Gaitskell ended up causing him to be shifted to the position of Secretary of State for War. Gaitskell would take over from his former boss and be promoted to Minister for Fuel and Power. Now, Gaitskell's promotion had been swift, and it was still a relatively young age at which he was promoted, but it was entirely due to his own clear abilities. He'd been able to ensure the nationalisation of coal and then subsequently the nationalisation of electricity whilst Under Secretary of State, and had helped fight the government's policies on energy and electricity despite complaints from some backbenchers. He was able to marshal the troops much better than many other Labour backbenchers at the time were. So his time as Minister of the Fuel was very much, it was a promotion that was very much deserved, but it was one that was not without incident. And the reason that this is because Gaitskell was not always the best at communicating himself. At one point, prior to becoming Minister of Fuel during municipal elections, he had suggested that it would be better to save energy, that people didn't take baths as regularly, which caused Winston Churchill to quip in the House of Commons that now he understood why the government were in bad odour. So there were lots of jokes like that were provoked by Gaitskell's rather unfortunate blunder just prior to becoming Minister of Fuel for Power, which marked his time in office. But I think it's also at this point worth pointing out that the fuel crisis came at a time when Labour was struggling. It was one of the many factors that would eventually see Labour lose in 1951 because it didn't help the Labour Party's image. Really, Attlee's government had been able to achieve things that are simply incredible in terms of the pace at which they were achieved, the conditions in which they were achieved at. We have to remember that when Attlee became Prime Minister, Britain was still at war, Japan hadn't surrendered yet, and throughout his time in office, there were many international issues which were on the horizon, both with the United States and with communist nations as well. Attlee would end up being forced to go into Korea to fight alongside the Americans. And so it was a time in which there were a great many pressures and a great deal was achieved. But at the same time, it was an era in which there were great unfortunate events such as the winter of 46-47, which made Labour not look as dynamic and not look as much as it was providing the sunlit uplands that had been promised at the 1945 election. It essentially made Labour look as if it was not doing as well as it could be doing, even though at the end it wasn't really the Labour Party's fault, but a series of events that were happening around the world that were outside of its control. So Gaitskell, when Minister of Fuel and Power, had to make a clear stance on the petrol issue, on the issue of fuel, because if he didn't, then it would, of course, harm the Labour Party. And we're going to listen to a clip now, one of the very early clips of Gaitskell as a minister talking about the petrol disaster.
The withdrawal of the basic ration has meant a lot of inconvenience to a lot of people. It's very tiresome, if you've got a car or motorbike, to have to lay it up because you can't get any petrol. And it's irritating, even if you get petrol, not to be able to use it freely. But you know, a government that's not prepared to do unpopular things when they're really necessary isn't worth much. Why did we have to stop basic? Well, it's like this. Petrol costs dollars. And just at the moment, we're not earning enough dollars, not nearly enough, to buy what we need in the way of food and materials merely to keep ourselves going. Every month.
It's interesting listening to that clip to hear how Gaitskell handled the petrol crisis. And it's interesting that his efforts were marked by a need to place priority on food and accessibility to transport. In a way, he was trying to make sure that the petrol stretched as much as possible. However, for many people in the country, this would feel as if, well, what's really changed with Labour in power? You know, we've elected a Labour government, but we've still got rationing, we've still got issues with transport, we're still not getting heat. Why aren't things changing? Why aren't they becoming better? Even though that there were these great changes that were occurring through nationalisation of various industries and the foundation of the NHS. Incredible achievements in retrospect, but for many people at the time, they simply seemed to not do anything for them at their precise circumstances at that precise moment. Now, whilst the petrol crisis was something that was directly affecting Gaitskell, there were even bigger issues that he would soon have to come to terms with, and that would be devaluation of the pound. And Stafford Cripps, who was Chancellor of the time, was unable to deal with the weight of devaluation because he was suffering from cancer. Cripps went to Switzerland to recuperate, and so although Attlee didn't want to, say that Cripps had cancer because Cripps wanted to keep it secret, he had to effectively say, oh, well, the Chancellor is just having a rest because of all the hard work that he's done, so I'm going to have these three ambitious young men, take over many of the responsibilities of the Chancellorship, though, of course, this was all unofficial. They weren't co-chancellors, as it were. It was rather breaking down the duties of the Chancellor to three different departments. Gaitskell was one of them, and he was joined by Douglas Jay, who was the Economic and later Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and Gaitskell's old rival, Harold Wilson, who was now President of the Board of Trade. Now, the issue that they had to face, the big issue that the trio had to face, was that of devaluation, because it was something that seemed to be necessary, but it was one that Cripps wasn't in favour of. Indeed, Jay and Gaitskell saw devaluation as the only way forward. However, Wilson was on the same side as Cripps, or he was part of the time. Wilson vacillated over whether or not it would be a good idea, which would be repeated in 1967 when he would also have to devalue the pound. But he would yo-yo between being in favour of devaluation and then being against devaluation. It was a bit of a mess in terms of agreement between the three, because all three really needed to agree on the position so that they could argue it to the other members of the cabinet. Many other members of the cabinet were also not happy about the prospect of devaluation of the pound, and also so that they could argue it with Cripps. Eventually, Cripps would sign off on devaluation because it was seen as the only way forward, the only way that Britain could revive the economy and also ensure that the United States still had confidence in the UK. However, prior to devaluation being signed off, there is an interesting incident in which the three men, Jay, Wilson and Gaitskell, had a bit of a tussle over who was going to deliver a note to Cripps notifying him that devaluation was in the offing, that it was going to be the way forward and that he needed to come back to officially sign it off. And Wilson, out of the three, eventually the one who had been most against devaluation, was very much able to take advantage of this opportunity and to go forward with giving Cripps the note. Now, what's interesting about this is that it really is during his period in the 1945 government that the image of Wilson as a shifty arch manipulator comes to the forefront, because he was for devaluation, then against it, then for it, then against it, and then he wanted to be the one to go off and to tell Cripps that devaluation was going to be in the offing, that he needed to get back to the UK so he could sign it off. So Wilson's reputation really does come from this period, and I think it's perhaps slightly justified, because certainly the issue of devaluation, he was both wanting to have his cake and eat it in terms of being for and against, but also it is slightly unfair because it was such a major issue at the time that it certainly needed a certain amount of thought, but Wilson certainly took too long to think about the issue than really he should have done. Following the 1950 general election, Gaitskell would become Minister for Economic Affairs, which was effectively Deputy Chancellor, although he was still outside the cabinet. Things seemed, with the 1950 election, to be settled in terms of the government's immediate future. Although the win had been much slighter than in 1945, there was at least a sense that if Labour could continue to be united, that it would be able to continue on until the mid-1950s, that the next election would be 1955 and Attlee would still be Prime Minister. However, whilst this was the hope, it of course wasn't the reality. There were clear tensions at the heart of the government during this period. Harold Wilson once quipped that being in charge of his Labour cabinet was like being a Bolshevik in charge of a Tsarist cabinet. in some ways, this is perhaps the opposite of Attlee's predicament, because the main issue for both the government and the backbenchers was that many of the backbenchers didn't see Attlee's government as left-wing enough, something that is quite surprising by today's standards, but certainly many of those on the backbenches, of the Labour backbenchers, didn't feel that enough was being done to end rationing, and that the financial policy wasn't left-wing enough, that there wasn't enough redistribution, and also there was an issue on funding for the NHS. And one of those who was most opposed to any charges being introduced into the newly founded NHS was, of course, Wales, perhaps one of Wales' finest orators, Nye Bevan. And it's important to make a point of this. Bevan and Gaitskell did not get along. And so when prescription charges came to the forefront, Bevan was even more incensed that it would be Gaitskell who would be the one that is introducing them, because Cripps's cancer, his ill health, finally got the better of him when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer. And whilst it's perhaps extraordinary to think of Gaitskell's rise from a backbencher to Chancellor in just over 5 years, it's a feat that was recently accomplished by the current incumbent of number 11. So it's not quite as surprising as perhaps we might otherwise think. However, even though he was now Chancellor, Gaitskell had more to prove to himself. He was now taking on one of the great offices of state, despite never having actually been in the cabinet before. All of his ministerial positions prior to that had been outside the cabinet. And we're going to listen now to a clip of Gaitskell discussing his assumption of the chancellorship, because it, in a way, shows how, in some ways, he was perhaps not entirely ready for the role.
In his absence, I shall do my best to see that our defences are built up, and that consistent with that, our economic recovery is maintained.
And do you think, sir, there'll be any let-up in austerity?
We'll I'm not going to have a press conference through the newsreel at the moment. We'll have some talk afterwards.
And what is quite clear to detect in this bit is that Gaitskell is very nervous over austerity. The issue would provoke him to insist on the need for prescription charges, which had been in one form or the other in the offing for a while, and that would be the move that would incense Bevan the most. It would incense him to resign, alongside Harold Wilson, who during this time was known as Nye's little dog, because of his association with Bevan. But really, in many ways, the split between Gaitskell and Bevan was a symptom of a wider problem. The attempt to balance the cost of continuing to build up Britain's defences, the nuclear defence programme and other things like that, and to be, with the Americans, but also to, expand expense on things like nationalisation and the NHS. And realistically, there was no way that both could be paid for without some compromise one way or the other. Certainly, prescription charges were not as much of an impediment on the NHS as perhaps some of the other things that came later on the NHS. But for Bevan and for the Bevanites, it was seen as essentially tantamount to sacrilege that there was any payment introduced into the NHS. And certainly would have obviously been preferable that there wasn't any charge for prescription, but the economic realities of the time meant that it would be an issue that had to be settled one way or the other, and would bring a certain amount of money, though not a great amount of money, back into the Treasury coffers. So the splits between the Bevanites and those who were not aligned with Bevan, not quite the Attleeites, but the different factions in the Labour Party, combined together with, as we've already discussed, the February 1947 fuel crisis, Korea, the Iranian oil crisis, to mean that eventually, although Labour had seemingly been strong throughout its period in office under Attlee, Labour would lose the 1951 election and Churchill would be returned as Prime Minister, even though, as many people today like to point out, Attlee won more votes than Churchill's Conservatives, even though, of course, Churchill managed to gain more seats from Labour. It's interesting to think of the 1951 election in the perspective of the Labour saltweights of the time, the Labour giants of the period, because Attlee, for example, believed that Churchill's victory would only be temporary. He believed that he would be Prime Minister back as early as 1953 because he didn't think the Conservatives would be able to cope. And in this way, Attlee and many of the other members of the Cabinet underestimated the Conservatives' ability to survive and ability to appeal to the electorate. It's also interesting to note that with the 1951 election, Hugh Gaitskell would never live to see Labour in government again, because of course he would never live to see the 1964 election victory. But now that we enter the 1950s, this is the period in which Gaitskell would become more and more significant. Although he was Shadow Chancellor, a position that obviously does not have as much power as that of Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was in a prime position to assume the leadership should Attlee resign. But Attlee didn't want to resign in 1951 because, as I said a moment ago, he thought he would be Prime Minister again in 1953. And in complete and utter honesty, it's easy to understand why he felt that he shouldn't resign, because this was the man who had effectively rebuilt the Labour Party during the 1930s, following the annihilation of the 1931 election. He's the man who had led it to victory in 1945 and 1950, and he was the man who was seen by many as the embodiment of the Labour Party. He'd been Labour leader for decades now, for just 20 years. He would eventually become leader for over 20 years. But it's, incredible to think that Attlee didn't think that he should step down, having been leader so long. But really, in many ways, you can understand why he didn't, because he thought he would be Prime Minister again, and he had put so much time and effort into rebuilding Labour that, well, why should he step down? He'd made such an incredible success of it that one minor election defeat, as 1951 was seen, shouldn't have impeded him, and he certainly, and many others, felt that he shouldn't step down. Of course, others were of the opinion that he should step down as soon as possible. But as prominently Herbert Morrison, who wanted to launch a leadership campaign as soon as possible, but in the end, not many people thought that Morrison would be better as leader than Attlee, so Attlee remained leader. Now that Labour was into opposition, back into the wilderness, Bevan was determined that he would do Gaitskell down, because he saw Gaitskell as someone who was very much the antithesis of him. In fact, he remarked at the time that in the next Labour government, Gaitskell should be demoted to the level of a junior clerk. So much did he despise Hugh Gaitskell. Tony Benn, who had just entered Parliament thanks to a by-election caused by Stafford Cripps' decision to step down as an MP, noted in his diary that he thought that Gaitskell was intellectually arrogant, obstinate and patronising. I respect but cannot quite admire him. Benn obviously shared the opinion of Bevan and many on the left, who saw Gaitskell as not just a figure on the right, but a sort of a patronising and overly smug leader who would not, lead the Labour Party in the right direction. Of course, slightly ironically, both Benn and Bevan would end up working in some capacity for Gaitskell when he became leader. Gaitskell, meanwhile, was going back to his natural inclination, which was to make these quite emotive and quite appealing speeches which attacked Bevan in a very veiled way, but attacked Bevan and the left. One example of that comes not long after the 1951 election in 1952, when he was in Stalybridge, when he declared that 1/6 of Labour constituency delegates were communist or communist-inspired. He also attacked many of the frustrated journalists in the Labour Party who he felt had led Labour astray. He was mainly thinking of people like Michael Foot, who of course had been a journalist and was still in part a journalist when he was elected as a Labour MP. What's interesting is that Gaitskell's inference of communists in Labour was not something that was new. Labour had been, tarnished by saying it was a communist party, and of course communists had been associated with Labour in the past, but it was not a new insult. But what was new was the idea of communist infiltration. Clearly, Gaitskell was taking at least some inspiration from American politicians at this time, in particular Senator Joe McCarthy, who during this period was stoking up a Red Scare and saying that communists were infiltrating the American civil service, the American army, all aspects of American life, and was causing a great hysteria about the invasive nature of communism. Fortunately, McCarthyism, the Red Scare, never caught on in the UK in the same way as it did in the US. There were, of course, still accusations of communism in British public life, but it wasn't on the same scale as the accusations that were made in the United States. So, luckily, Gaitskell didn't go down the route of being a red baiter in the same way that McCarthy did. But what was clear from this speech, and from this speech onwards, is that Gaitskell marked himself out as an opposite, an enemy, in direct competition with Bevan, the Bevanites, and the left of the Labour Party, because it was them that he were suggesting were, in many ways, communists or communist-inspired, the very left of Labour. One of the things that is interesting is that the clashes over who would be leader would continue throughout the 1950s because Attlee remained leader. He didn't want to step down. That is, until the 1955 election, in which, again, Labour was defeated and Labour lost seats. So Attlee decided to step down, and there were a number of candidates who put them forward. Gaitskell decided to put himself forward because he was one of the most senior shadow cabinet ministers, but also probably the youngest candidate by far to enter the race. Morrison and Bevan were both much older than Gaitskell and also entered the race. They had previously stood for the leadership of the Labour Party and lost. And the Parliamentary Labour Party, who decided who would be leader at this point in Labour's history, decided that Gaitskell was the best bet because he was the younger man. No sooner had Gaitskell assumed the leadership of the Labour Party in December 1955 than he was faced with perhaps one of the greatest crises in British history, and one he hoped to make political advantage of. Suez proved to be a gift for Gaitskell because it was an utter disaster, completely of the Conservatives' own making. Anthony Eden's attempts to take back the Suez Canal from President Nasser were a complete and utter failure. Not simply because Eden did not fully understand Nasser's reasoning, but because he believed that the Americans would simply support him. President Eisenhower thought that the entire idea was not only military dubious, but also not worth American involvement. Eden learned to his cost that sometimes the special relationship could be rather one-sided. Gaitskell used it as an opportunity to both attack the government and to build up his profile, and he went across to America to appear on the US programme Press Conference, a version of Meet the Press, in which a prominent politician would be interviewed. During the programme, Gaitskell was quizzed on why he had compared Nasser to Hitler, to which he offered this response.
No, that's not fair, if I may say so. I said in my first speech that he talked like Hitler, and I repeated that in my last speech. But I said we mustn't draw the conclusion from this that the position is exactly the same as it was in 1936 or 37 or 38. But I don't want to stop all the questions.
It is perhaps somewhat extraordinary to our modern sensibilities for Gaitskell to make a comparison between one of the most vile dictators in history and a democratically elected president who wanted to simply use the natural resources in his own country for the benefit of the people of Egypt and not of Egypt's former colonial masters. This exchange perhaps demonstrates, as does his 1,000 Years of History speech, that in many ways Gaitskell still viewed the world through a somewhat imperialist lens. Not to say that he wanted Britain to have an empire again, but that he couldn't quite work out why there was a substantive difference between Nasser and Hitler. It's also interesting to note that both major political leaders at this point, the leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of the Labour Party were both former old Oxfordians who had both been privately educated. And whilst Gaitskell and Eden fundamentally disagreed on many things, it's likely that they would have gotten on better and been able to find more common ground than either of them would have done with NASA. Of course, it's well known that Eden in particular was known to utterly hate NASA, and that was one of the factors that resulted in the Suez Crisis and motivated his decision to attempt to retake the Suez Canal. However, despite the gains Gaitskell made in publicity and in the opinion polls, Gaitskell and Labour had led the Conservatives in the opinion polls since Gaitskell became leader. And following Eden's resignation, Labour led the Conservatives by, on average, about 5 points. It was sometimes on-off that. It would ultimately not come to much fruition. Gaitskell's leads throughout the late 60s and up to the 1959 election, which at one point culminated in a 19-point lead over the Conservatives, began to shrink towards the end of 1958 and going into 1959. And this, of course, meant that the election of 1959, which in some ways prior to that for many years, from Gaitskell's election onwards, had seemed like it would be quite a substantive Labour win, ended up looking as if it would either be a close-run thing or that the Conservatives would win outright. The 1959 election manifesto that Gaitskell fought on was one which declared that despite Harold Macmillan's assertion that the British public had never had it so good, the Gaitskell manifesto asserted that there were many millions of have-nots rather than the haves that Gaitskell said that the Conservatives overemphasised. The manifesto also pledged to reduce class sizes to 30, abolish the 11+ exam, spend $50 million a year on hospital development, and establish a sports council and a national theatre. However, unfortunately for both Gaitskell and the Labour Party, the British public decided that Macmillan's assertions were closer to their hearts than Gaitskell's. The 1959 election was not even really a close-run thing. It was a bit of a drubbing for Labour. Labour lost 20 seats and won slightly fewer votes than in 1955. Gaitskell's youth had not reversed the seeming decline of the party, and soon there were whispers from some on the left, some on the Bevanite left, that Gaitskell should go. However, he decided to double down and declared that Labour was not trusted enough, and decided that what he needed to do was to modernise the party. And his first aim, in terms of modernisation, was the abolishment of Clause 4. However, Gaitskell failed to realise that the scale of support for nationalisation as a concept within the party was such that his attempt to get rid of Clause 4 would ultimately not be successful. This, of course, is somewhat ironic given that Gaitskell himself had been responsible for the nationalisation of coal and electricity. On the issue of Clause 4, Gaitskell would not be able to push through reforms, and the showdown over Clause 4 and its eventual changing will not occur for another few decades until Tony Blair successfully rewrote it in 1995. Whilst the 50s had been a time of optimism for both Gaitskell and in some ways the Labour Party, that the setback of 1951 would be reversed hopefully by the end of the decade, as the 1960s dawned for Gaitskell and Labour, it wasn't good. Gaitskell was in a very unfortunate position. His party lagged behind the Conservatives in the opinion polls, and he faced two competitive leadership elections in 1960 and 1961, the first against his old rival and eventual successor, Harold Wilson. Leadership elections during this period would regularly occur after a general election at the start of a new parliamentary term, the leader of the Labour Party, though usually they were uncontested elections. 1960 and 61 are interesting because there are alternative candidates who put themselves forward. Only two, one alternative candidate against Gaitskell in each election. However, the fact that there were these alternative candidates is very significant because it showed that even within the Parliamentary Labour Party there was a certain dissatisfaction with Gaitskell. And it would be essentially two issues which would form the final years of Gaitskell's leadership, that of unilateral military disarmament, and the potential of Britain's membership of the European Economic Community, the EEC as it was then known. So on unilateral disarmament, most of the Parliamentary Labour Party favoured multilateral disarmament as opposed to unilateral disarmament, whereas a great deal of the membership, and particularly those on the left of the Labour Party's membership and the left of the PLP, favoured unilateral disarmament. So this was a time when the concept of American bombs and American nuclear capability was coming under more and more question, whereas during the Attlee government they'd been seen as a natural reaction to the state of the world at the time. Labour, going forward into the 50s and the 60s, saw them as more of a hindrance and more of, particularly those on the Labour left, more as a sign of American imperialism. And the issue came to the head at what is known as the Battle of Scarborough, the 1960 Labour Party conference, in which Gaitskell made a brilliant speech, which we'll cover more in a future episode, which attacked the idea of unilateral disarmament. And he suggested that it was at least partly motivated by attempts to remove him as leader of the party.
Another possibility to which I must make reference, because I have read so much about it, that the issue here is not really defense at all, but the leadership of this party. Let me repeat what Manny Shinwell said. The place to decide the leadership of this party is not here, but in the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Gaitskell's speech against the motion that Labour support unilateral disarmament at the 1960 conference has entered political mythology as a moment in which a party leader pushed back against his members, many of his members, and won. Indeed, the defeat of the motion to adopt unilateral disarmament was in part a direct result of Gaitskell's speech. The speech, like the one that we're looking at in this episode, demonstrated that when Gaitskell had an issue he was truly passionate about, he could, in fact, be a good orator. However, the idea of nuclear weapons, the issue of nuclear weapons, would become particularly potent in the year of his 1,000 Years of History speech, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 proved to be the tipping point for the world as the United States and the USSR stood off against one another over the issue of missile bases in Cuba. Now, whilst the crisis actually occurred later on in October 1962, so after his 1,000 Years of History speech, it's worth looking at it before we look at the speech, because they reflect in a similar way to his attitude on NASA, Gaitskell's relationship with foreign affairs and his sometimes rather strange approach to certain foreign affairs issues. So, for example, this clip that we're going to listen to now is a reaction to the news of the blockades and Gaitskell's critique of the way that the Americans and the USSR approached the issue of Cuba.
As a result of your meeting today, can you tell me what conclusions you've come to about Cuba?
On Cuba, we say that if indeed it is true that long-range missile bases have been set up in Cuba, that this is a provocative action which must be condemned. We must have some sympathy with the Americans in the position that they find themselves. And we suggest that if there's any doubt about this, some observers appointed by the United Nations should go and see what is actually happening. At the same time, we are worried about the United States blockade. This is a very doubtful legality in international law, and of course it can have very serious consequences both in the Caribbean and in other parts of the world. And in particular, we regret that the United States government didn't consult its allies before taking this decision, and didn't take it to the United Nations Security Council first. Now the question is, what is to be done? Well, we believe that everything should be done to try to settle the dispute, that there should be the utmost restraint by all concerned to avoid actual conflict.
How do you think that should be achieved?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I would like Mr. Macmillan to go to Washington to explore with the Americans, and indeed with the Russians if he meets them, what can be done in this way. I also think he should go there because we must have now, at any rate, very close consultation with the United States in view of what may happen in other parts of the world.
I notice in your statement you did say if with regard to the missile bases. Have you any doubt about the evidence, Mr. Gaitskell?
Well, it looks pretty conclusive, but if the Russians deny it and say, no, there's no truth in that, we told you there weren't any, we say there aren't any, well, then I think somebody should go and see.
I personally think that what's so interesting about this is that Gaitskell was so circumspect, suggesting that if the Russians declared that there were no missile sites in Cuba, then the world should effectively take their word at face value, that there should be, not as much of a dismissal of Russia's assertions. Now, this partly flew in the face of sense, because the Russians were hardly going to say, oh yes, we have been building lots of nuclear missile bases in Cuba, but also it seems somewhat at odds regarding Gaitskell's stance on communism. Gaitskell had previously, attacked membership of certain constituency Labour parties because he thought that they had too many communists and communist influence. And at the same time, he doesn't sound quite shoulder to shoulder with the United States on the blockade and on America's position. Now, of course, it is worth pointing out that Gaitskell did not have the same access to information as, say, for example, later Labour leaders would traditionally get from the government. Macmillan hadn't given him the same information that he had received from President Kennedy. In fact, Gaitskell, when he visited Kennedy later in 1962, commented that Kennedy had provided him with more information related to Britain's relationship with the US and to military defence than he had received from Macmillan. So there was certainly a sense that Macmillan wasn't getting the full, that Gaitskell rather wasn't getting the full picture from Macmillan. However, it still seems quite extraordinary that Gaitskell would take this attitude, and like the NASA quotes, his mouth seems to have run away with him in terms of making assertions and remarks that weren't quite fully in tune with the facts, and certainly were not in line with one of Britain's closest allies, the evidence that had been presented to Britain by the Americans. However, what these comments do illustrate was a similar approach that Gaitskell had taken earlier that month at the Labour Party conference, in which he'd argued that Britain should not join the European Economic Community. As with Cuba, Gaitskell's speech, his 1,000 Years of History speech, was one in which he placed emphasis on viewing both sides of the discussion, of coming to both sides of the discussion from viewing the evidence and using evidence rather than emotion. His approach to the EEC was broadly popular with many members of the party's left, as well as with the public. Entry into the European Economic Community, the European Common Market, was not really very popular with the public at this point. There were some who were quite in favour of it, but a lot of people took Gaitskell's view that it might threaten Britain's status around the world. So even though there were the likes of Roy Jenkins, who was one of Gaitskell's most loyal lieutenants, in favour and banging the drum for Britain joining the EEC, the United States similarly wanted Britain to join. A large amount of the public didn't support the move and saw it as something that would lessen Britain's stance on the world stage, a stance that Gaitskell also took, as you can see in the speech. What's interesting is that Gaitskell's background demonstrates why he felt that such a move would be unpatriotic and risk Britain being swallowed up in the EEC in a federal Europe, which was the great fear at the time. Gaitskell's position in many ways was almost romantic to him, as it was practical. Nye Bevan once noted that Gaitskell had a tendency to be over-emotional, And it's not out of the realms of possibility that Gaitskell's emotions stirred him to make the conference speech, and in some ways he felt he had to tack on more economic reasoning to make the picture more balanced. So he begins the speech by declaring that he wished to present the document Labour and the Common Market to the assembled representatives of the conference, and that he wished to present the logic of the report to conference. He went on to declare in the early opening stages of the speech, "We can all agree on the tremendous significance of this debate. We can also agree that it is already warm in this hall, and likely to become much hotter as the day goes on. Do not, therefore, let us get overheated. I plead at the start for tolerance. Tolerance in particular between those who hold the most extreme views in this controversy. Those who, on the one hand, would like to see Britain enter Europe whatever the conditions, and those who, on the other hand, are opposed to Britain entering Europe on any conditions." Whilst Gaitskell's positions will be clear the further we go into the speech, his clear pleading for the debate on the issue to not be overly emotive is an important sign that he wished to place his arguments as one that was not put forth by emotion, but rather reason. And this is particularly important because this speech was in a large part driven by emotion and contained a great deal of emotive language. It's interesting the use of emotion as contrasting the use of facts that Gaitskell employs, because this is a speech that is often thought of in terms of the famous emotive 1,000 Days of History section, and yet Gaitskell wanted it not to be seen as an overly romantic or emotive speech. In fact, he states as much in this next section. "It is not a matter to be settled by attractive pictures of nice old German gentlemen drinking beer on the one hand, or, on the other, by a race or national hatred stimulated by past experiences. It should not be decided because, on the one hand, we like Italian girls, or, on the other, we think we would be fleeced in Italian hotels. It should not be decided on the basis of whether we think French food is the best in the world, or because, as one of my correspondents put it, she was afraid Europe was out to poison us." Gaitskell's use of stereotypes is both strikingly relevant. How often has Britain's debates on its relationship to Europe been dominated by stereotypes? But it's also striking that he attempts to again make his argument about an unemotional analysis of Britain's position. Given the emotive declaration of 1,000 years of British history in the section of the speech later on, and the one that is most remembered but also repeated, it's somewhat ironic that Gaitskell spends great chunks of his speech rejecting the very same emotive argument. Gaitskell then repeats his argument that he believes Britain would not be inherently economically weaker if it did go into Europe, but nor that it would be inherently economically stronger if it did. History would disprove his argument on Britain not going in, making it economically weaker, at least in the short term. He then goes on to quote Sir Douglas MacDougall, a friend of Macmillan, who stated, "There is no really compelling economic argument for Britain's joining unless it is thought that, without being exposed to the blast of competition from the continent, she will never put her house in order." Gaitskell then argues that whilst the Conservatives may believe that Britain can only put its house in order by wanting to join the EEC, under Labour that would not be the case. Gaitskell then re-emphasises that whilst membership of the EEC would bring down barriers between Britain and the other 6 member states of the EEC, it would bring up barriers between Britain and the rest of the Commonwealth. It's interesting to consider that Gaitskell's use of the Commonwealth and trade with the Commonwealth stretches back to his imperial roots. Let's not forget that he grew up in an era in which posters declaring the great power of Britain's trade with other parts of the Commonwealth then of the Empire, such as New Zealand to be able to get lamb from New Zealand, or posters saying how much tea was being imported for India. These were posters that were commonplace and widely seen as a measure of Britain's success. Like his handling of Suez, Gaitskell is still, although a Labour Party member, a Labour Party activist, a Labour leader, one who has attachments to the Empire. It is perhaps somewhat surprising to consider that both his immediate predecessor, Clement Attlee and his immediate successor, Harold Wilson, had three qualities in common. All three had, at times, romantic visions of the legacy of empire. Attlee may have been the Prime Minister who gave India its independence, but the rushed and botched job of partition demonstrates not a desire to truly engage with the issues that came with empire, but rather a need to get a painful chapter over and done with. The same resonances can be seen throughout Gaitskell's speech. The Commonwealth is mentioned 56 times in Gaitskell's speech. Clearly, there were lingerings in his imagination of the old imperial ways, and the issue of Britain's relationship with the Commonwealth and with its empire still had sway over Gaitskell in relation to the European question. Yet Gaitskell's speech should not be seen as motivated solely or purely by the Commonwealth. He marshals economic facts well in the speech to paint a picture of Britain that should not feel compelled to join the EEC. Gaitskell argues that the lack of tariffs from EEC countries, rather than helping Britain, would only end up harming competitiveness in the UK. Then there is the argument which describes as the fresh breeze of competition. It is a strange argument to use. It is said that we should go into the common market because tariffs will be reduced against us, that it is because it is going to be easier to sell there, and our competitive position is improved. But they say at the same time, our firms will benefit from finding it harder to compete at home because they no longer have the protection they enjoy at present. You cannot have it both ways. It is either better for industry to have tougher competition, which it will certainly get at home, or better for it to have easier conditions, which it will get in the markets of the sixth. Both arguments cannot be true. Gaitskell clearly favours the argument that an approach to trade which is competitive, a theme of competitiveness that he uses throughout the speech, would be better than Britain becoming a member of the EEC. Certainly, the issue of competitiveness was sometimes inaccurately presented by the pro-European side, but at the same time, the need for greater access to Britain's nearest economic partners was one that was certainly necessary for the economy to grow and to rebuild following the Second World War. Gaitskell then moves from the economic argument to the argument about Britain's sovereignty, British freedom, the part of the speech that is particularly well known. He delivers the famous line to great support and applause.
For we are not just a part of Europe, at least not yet. We have a different history, we have ties and links which run across the whole world. If this is the idea, the end of Britain as an independent nation state, I make no apology for repeating it, the end of 1,000 years of history. You may say, all right, let it end. But my goodness, it's a decision that needs a little care and thought.
Gaitskell's remarks here are an indication of the passion that he felt regarding Britain's role in the world. The emotional detachment that Gaitskell implores near the start of his speech is fundamentally gone. He now focuses on a speech that is dealing with Britain's independence, on Britain's freedom from a federal Europe, a Britain standing alone. Gaitskell's turn of phrase, 1,000 years of history, is not only striking, but it's also memorable and stirring in some ways. Here, Gaitskell's oratory relies on invoking a semi-mythical vision of Britain alone. Britain standing against Hitler, Britain standing against Napoleon, etc., etc. A Britain that was not interfered with by foreign powers and could do as it could want to. It is the Britain of Gaitskell's childhood, the Britain of the imperial past, transposed into a speech given by the leader of the Labour Party in the early 60s. It is a fascinating and at times almost unique speech in that respect, in the way that it owes so much to the past and the past of the person who's giving it, and yet it is a speech that in many ways points towards the future rhetorical turns against the EU that were used by the Vote Leave campaign. Indeed, Vote Leave and Leave.eu used this clip, this 1,000 years clip, to argue against Labour's position on remaining a part of the European Union in the 2016 referendum campaign. So it's fascinating to see that this part of the speech that is almost harking back to the past is one that also is pointing towards the future and would be used in the future. Coming towards the end of the speech, Gaitskell makes his final, vivid, literary, emotive climax, his end to the speech.
We must reject the terms so far negotiated, for they are not adequate. They do not fulfill either our own conditions or the government pledges. But no final decision can be taken until we know the final terms. And when that moment comes, we shall judge it in the light of the conditions we have laid down. I still hope profoundly there may be such a change of heart in Europe as will make this possible. I appeal to our socialist comrades to use what influence they can, alas, all too little, in the Brussels negotiations to bring this about. After all, if we could carry the Commonwealth with us, safeguarded, flourishing, prosperous, if we could safeguard agriculture, our EFTA friends were all in it, if we were secure in our employment policy, if we were able to maintain our independent foreign policy and yet have this wider, looser association with Europe, it would indeed be a great idea. But if this should not prove to be possible, if the Six will not give it us, if the British government will not even ask for it, then we must stand firm by what we believe for the sake of Britain and the Commonwealth and the world. And we shall not flinch from our duty if that moment
comes. It is a bombastic end to the speech that sets out to argue that Britain should only join the EEC if it is thought that it would be in Britain's interest. It is meant to be a speech that is not taking sides, but quite clearly Gaitskell has taken a side, and there is a clear side to it. It is one that relies on the argument of trade with the Commonwealth, but it is also one that relies on a sort of emotive turn from the audience listening to it. Gaitskell was in some ways perhaps fortuitous in his demands in the speech, because Gaitskell demands that Britain shouldn't be part of a highly regulated federalised Europe, and that there should be, if Britain were to join the EEC, a certain amount of flexibility, and that Britain should almost have a custom-made deal with the other then 6 countries of the EEC, which of course, as I say, is fortuitous because Britain's relationship with the EEC and later the EU would be different from any other country in the rest of the economic and political union. And in many respects, that was because it was much looser. It was less of a hard and fast deal, as it would evolve over time. A sort of deal and arrangement that Gaitskell would perhaps have approved of, perhaps not. It's obviously impossible to tell. His speech is in many ways something of a gallimaufry. It attempts to balance both reason and emotion, and achieves in many respects that balance well, though at times it leans more into the emotional rather than the detached, analytical evidence-based argument. It's a speech that's well written and clearly argued, though the critique of Britain joining the EU is at times very thinly veiled, and perhaps it would have been a stronger speech overall had Gaitskell been somewhat more explicit that he opposed Britain's entry to the EEC, rather than attempting to paint a picture of it, oh well, if we can get this, if we can get that, then potentially we could join the EEC. It is one that certainly is anti-EEC rather than necessarily an entirely balanced argument. It's one that is built upon emotions, and as Nye Bevans said, Gaitskell was a man that was ruled by his emotions, and perhaps it is this feeling that links back to his background and back to the Empire and back to the Commonwealth that stirred Gaitskell to deliver this speech and to write this speech. It is emotion more than facts that I think motivated Gaitskell in making this speech. It's a speech that was admired more by his foes than by his friends. Indeed, his wife commented at the time that all the people clapping during the speech were the wrong people. In other words, people on the left of the party. The likes of Tony Benn, were not unfavourable to the speech, and Roy Jenkins, his loyal lieutenant, would contrastingly comment many years later that he felt sick as it was being given. Helped remind the public of Gaitskell and gave him, an encouraged stance within the public, within people in Britain. It was a speech that revived support for him, both in the public and among the parts of the Labour Party that were usually against him, the left of the Labour Party. However, that support was short-lived. Hugh Gaitskell died 4 months later, on the 18th of January 1963. He was only 56. Some believe that had he lived, he would have become Prime Minister. For me, the jury is out. Whilst he had qualities of diligent hard work, and when he wanted to, he could craft genuinely great speeches and at times be somewhat impressive on television, he was also a politician out of his era. Unlike JFK or unlike Harold Wilson, his ability to use television was at times limited. In certain interviews, he came across less as a potential Prime Minister and more like a particularly donnish Oxford master, who could easily have been the subject of an M.R. James short story, or someone you could see running a department in government, but not necessarily a world leader. Similarly, his sometimes odd rationale, both with Suez and Cuba, demonstrated that he was a politician who could easily and practically get the job done in terms of getting legislation through the House, but when faced with a crisis that was outside his realms of experience, would sometimes seem somewhat at odds with dealing with the situation in the way you might expect it. Sometimes he seemed somewhat marooned and unable to find a paddle as he did during Suez and Cuba. Hugh Gaitskell rose to become leader of the Labour Party because he was an intelligent and formidable politician, but he was far from perfect. His background and approach to politics both hindered him and also formed him. He was often consumed more with his rivalries than building electoral coalitions. He is one of Labour's forgotten leaders for many people, but he does not deserve to be. His passion, drive and achievements, as well as his own peculiar flaws, make him a politician who is very much worth discussing. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then please do share it. You can subscribe on Spotify if you wish to do so. The next episode will cover Gordon Brown's 2009 New Labour Achievement Speech. I hope you'll join me